Let's get started. Let's welcome Josh Nolan for his topic today. The title of his topic is data-driven understanding of real-life moral dilemmas. And Josh Nolan is would you like to introduce him or?
Oh, Josh came to us from the University of Melbourne and started MPhil about 2 years ago. Preceded by adventurous summer exploration into this topic. And he decided to actually stay on the topic and complete it. And he has at least two interesting sets of stories to tell about understanding data more dilemmas. Or why Reddit, what do people on Reddit think about as well?
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, over to you.
Cool. So I'm Josh. I'm from the Computational Media Lab, and today I'll present my MPhil completion talk. So the title is Understanding Real Life, Data-Driven Understanding of Real Life Moral Dilemmas. Just trying to time myself. So let's start with some motivation. When it comes to moral decision making, a lot of us are familiar with the so-called trolley problem. Dilemmas like this are very dramatic, they're idealized, and they serve in a lot of scenarios as effective thought experiments. But the sort of moral dilemmas people have every day is much different. For example, is it wrong to quit our job while the company is understaffed? How about unfriending someone who just went through an episode of mental illness? Problems like this are relatively, small scale, they're low stakes, and they involve interpersonal conflicts that are quite hard to generalize. Recently, there's a growing interest in the way AI agents engage in moral conversations. So 2 years ago, Alan AI presented the Delphi prototype, which can generate moral judgments based on an action description. So according to their report, Delphi is a representation of, quote, how an average American might judge the ethicality or social acceptability of a given situation. Much has been said about this prototype, but concerns about its ability to generalize remain quite common. Another headline-grabbing system is ChatGPT, which is by OpenAI, and I'm sure everybody knows about it. The evidence of ChatGPT's competency in a range of tasks, cognitive tasks, makes it enticing to see how it engages in a moral conversation. Overall, it gives longer responses, not it's wrong, it's right, it's taboo or whatnot. And it can generate reasoning as well. However, there's a lot of concerns about its consistency in the responses it makes. So in this example, which was just in a recently published paper on Scientific Reports, the authors presented these two cases where you ask the same question in the same spirit of the trolley problem, but ChatGPT generated a somewhat utilitarian response in the first case, but somewhat deontological in the other. We share the computer science community's interest in the intersection of moral philosophy and AI. We think that, however, the sort of everyday morally charged situations we experience is quite different from the trolley problem or organ donation and so on. They're much more nuanced, they're complex, and they're quite specific. So in this project, we aim to study the features of everyday daily life moral dilemmas and specifically examine their role in the development of automated moral decision-making systems. So in the first study, we conduct a large-scale analysis of moral discussions on Reddit to find the most common topics from which moral dilemmas arise. And in the second study, we measure several important dimensions of morality in text, and we apply that to the analysis of moral beliefs and moral content in general on Twitter and Reddit. So let's move on to the first study. Here we ask ourselves several motivational questions. Given the vast landscape of moral dilemmas, what topics do people tend to discuss? What do these topics tell us about how people make moral judgments? And is there any observable distinction between what is considered moral and what's considered a social convention? We aim to answer these questions by analyzing a moral discussion forum on Reddit called Am I the Asshole? Or we'll call it AITA for short from now. So here's how it works. If you're a user, you can start a discussion by making a post describing a situation. You can ask the questions like, AITA for requesting prayer breaks at work, because my coworkers do, even though I'm not religious. Then the other users on Reddit will judge you by making comments below the post. Here are two examples of the judgments. One saying the author is NTA, not the asshole, or they're not in the wrong in general. And another comment below saying, well, they are. So the community members on this subreddit express their agreement or disagreement with a judgment by upvoting and downvoting. And the score of a judgment is determined by the number of upvotes minus downvotes. And after 18 hours, the highest scoring judgment will become what's called a final verdict of the post. And it appears as a flare in the post right there. So in this particular example, the flare or the final verdict of the post says the author is not in the wrong based on the highest scoring comment on top. So this subreddit is relatively large. Right now it has about 7.1 million subscribers, and it regularly ranks among the most discussed subreddits on this platform. So in our data set, we retrieve about 100,000 posts accompanied by 8 million comments from this subreddit spanning 6 years from 2014 to 2019. The dataset shows that the popularity of this subreddit measured in the number of posts grew very fast over the years. And we also observed that the most common verdict is not the asshole, so sympathetic towards the author. But in other cases, when comments judge the author to be in the wrong, they typically gather many more comments, replies in general. So what do? We start our analysis by identifying the topics of discussion on this haystack. So to do so, we use a text clustering method called LDA, latent dirichlet allocation, which is a model popular in computational social science to discover topics in this data set. And we then independently named each topic to ensure that they are representative, their names are succinct, and they help us with any later analyses we have. After resolving disagreement among us, we arrive at a total of 47 topics of discussion. Examples are work, celebrations, communication, and appearance. But we find that most of these topics do not fall into what are typically considered moral domains. Examples of these topics will be celebrations or appearance. Turn what on? Oh, right. You mean my camera? Oh, right. Okay. Oh, no, I'm using my laptop. This is just that computer. So my camera is on now.
So we have two cameras from there and here.
Okay. Okay. And then after we discover the topics, we want to study how humans perceive these topics in general. Questions like, are they relevant to a post? Do they sufficiently describe what a moral dilemma is? How many topics does each post, is each post about? To that end, we recruit crowdsourced workers online and randomly assign them a post. We ask them to label the post given the topics produced by our LDA model. And we have two important findings. The first finding is that humans tended to highly agree with what our model produced, which shows the efficacy of our approach. But what's more interesting is that, well, most people tended to think that
your background is blurred. You just don't blur your background so people maybe can see that.
Aren't they also seeing like?
Yeah, if they prefer
You can see the slides, it's fine. Jiwei, just let him talk.
Where was I? Yeah, what's more interesting in the second finding is that people tend to perceive more than one topic to be relevant to a post and to be specific about two topics, on average, about 1.7 topics. And this finding led us to define what's called a topic pair, or two topics, the most relevant topics to a post, to be defined as a thematic unit of description for each post. So we carried our analysis based on the topic pairs we discovered. And in here, after establishing that, humans perceive two topics to be relevant, we want to examine the patterns of judgment among topics and topic pairs. So in this particular plot called a tree map, each block corresponds to a topic. Each inner block corresponds to a secondary topics that are in a topic pair. And the bigger block, the more posts it has in the data set. The shade of each block corresponds to how likely a post in that block is judged negatively. So the lighter a block, the higher the likelihood that a post is judged the bad one. So patterns of judgment we observe vary across topics in quite non-trivial ways. So we note some examples of moral stories in topics such as jokes, relationships. They tend to be judged quite harshly compared to others. On the other hand, we have topics such as family, money, and roommates, which are much more likely to be sympathized by the Reddit community. So when we zoom in a typically harshly judged topic like jokes here, we find that not all posts in this topic tend to be judged harshly as well. For example, the secondary topic, family, gender, religion, tend to be sympathized by Redditors, whereas topics like manners or race tend to have the opposite effect. So in another analysis, we answer the question of what characterizes the differences among AITA topics or topic pairs in terms of moral framing. That is how a story is told. For each post, we extract what are called common emotional and linguistic categories. These are 194 of them based on a framework called MPhil. And some examples of these categories are disgust, shame, nervousness, contentment, and so on. And we assess the correlation between these categories and the moral judgment of a post makes. So in other words, does an emotional category tend to elicit a positive or negative judgment, if any? So in this figure, a red block represents a positive correlation with the negative judgment, so the asshole judgment, while a blue block represents the opposite, so a correlation with a positive judgment. We find that some emotional categories can elicit different moral valence in different topics. So an example which I highlight in here is independence. So this category correlates with negative judgment, which is in red, when we analyze the topic pair time and work in posts that are concerned with work and time. But it has the opposite effect when we consider that in another topic pair, say communication and money. So these correlation patterns suggest that words or categories can differ across topic pairs, and it illustrates the nuances of story framing in this subreddit. So to summarize the first study, we look at a large collection of moral discussions and discover a set of 4 dozen topics, and from which everyday moral dilemmas arise. The findings of this study highlight the importance of topic pairs in analyzing the patterns of story framing, that is how a story is told, and how a judgment is made. Let's now to our second study. Here we start with an interest in the representation of moral values or moral intuitions that can be operationalized to understand large-scale moral phenomena. So we adopt a popular approach in the moral psychology literature called the moral foundations theory. And according to this view, moral beliefs and judgments can be categorized into 5 fundamental dimensions, and they're called moral foundations. So here are 5 of them. The first one is authority subversion. So this foundation underlies intuitions about respect to and deference to higher authority figures, and it condemns actions portraying subversion or rebellion. The second foundation is care harm. It upholds the virtue of nurturing and protection and the avoidance of harm to one's well-being in general. The third foundation is fairness cheating. It's concerned with virtues of equal treatment and reward and vices of injustice. The fourth is loyalty betrayal. It relates to actions that prioritize one's groups or alliances and display patriotism, loyalty to one's family and country, so on. And finally, we have what's called sanctity degradation. This foundation is concerned with maintaining the sacredness of one's body and mind and upholds the virtues of protection from contamination in general. So the developers of this theory, including Jonathan Haidt with his book, The Righteous Mind, have shown concrete evidence that these moral dimensions or moral foundations exist across cultures and cover a wide, although arguably not exhaustive, set of moral intuitions. So it has been successfully used in several domains, and here are some examples. Perhaps the most popular application of the moral foundations theory is in characterizing the political divide along the US political spectrum. In this plot on the left-hand side, the x-axis represents people's ideology from strongly liberal to strongly conservative. The y-axis represents the people's ratings of the importance of these moral foundations. And a series of studies have made an important finding that liberals tend to be way more concerned with causes relating to the foundation's care and fairness. These include concerns about one's suffering or the commitment to social justice. On the other hand, conservatives tend to emphasize the other 3 foundations much more relative to liberals. They're concerned with values such as respect for police authorities, loyalty to their country, or commitment to their religious beliefs. The moral foundations theory has also been used to study sentiment beyond politics. So for example, in 2017, an analysis of 1,000 parents in the US has shown that parents who report high hesitancy toward vaccinating their children are twice as likely to emphasize the foundation sanctity. Whereas parents who are more accepting of vaccines in general are twice as likely to underscore the foundation authority. So the success of the moral foundations theory goes beyond these 2 representative examples. But based on that, we aim to adopt this theory to the understanding of moral beliefs present in large-scale social media datasets. Our purpose is to examine the relative importance of moral foundations in many specific topics of discussion. So to do so, we identify 3 public datasets containing tweets, news articles, and Reddit comments that are all annotated with moral foundations. We then use this dataset to train a range of classifiers to detect these foundations based on a textual input. The highest performing classifier achieves the highest performance we record in literature of around with the area under the ROC curve of up to 0.85. We also perform in the paper external evaluation using many other data sets, and the result also agree with this finding. So what do we do? with these classifiers. We first go back to the AITA dataset before, and we want to examine the patterns of framing and judgment again, but based on moral foundations. So what we did was use our classifier to label all of the posts and comments on this dataset, and we compare the relative frequency of moral foundations in a post or in an original post and in a judgment or a comment. So left-hand side is the plot for the post, and right-hand side is the plot for the verdict judgments. Okay, so the previous study have noted that, well, topic pairs seem to be a good candidate for covariate in analyzing this data set. So we also take a look at this. So this result is based on 700 posts and verdict judgments in the topic family and marriage. So all of these posts are concerned with family and marriage. And we observe that posts, so on the left-hand side, the radar plots on the left-hand side, posts are primarily concerned with the foundation loyalty. So an example post is AITA for refusing to speak to my father after finding out that he has a secret family. But when we look at judgments, when we look at verdicts on the other hand, which are radar plots on the right-hand side, they are much more diverse in terms of the moral foundations they care about. While it's true that loyalty here seems to be a prominent concern, but judgments also focus on other foundations such as fairness, care, and loyalty. We also find that judgments that are against the author, which are represented by the red pentagons here, they are significantly more concerned with fairness than those that are sympathetic towards the author, which are represented by the blue pentagons. So that's one of our analyses of AITA content using moral foundations. Moving on from AITA, we also use the moral foundations theory to analyze people's stance on some controversial topics. Our hypothesis is that conflicting stances toward a topic, so either for or against the topic, conflicting stances can be explained by their appeal to moral foundations. So we use a public data set which contains about 4,800 tweets based on 6 socially relevant topics. Climate change is a real concern, atheism, Donald Trump, the feminist movement, Hillary Clinton, and the legalization of abortion. In this data set, each tweet is annotated with a stance on a target topic. So on the right-hand side, you are seeing 3 example tweets with 3 different stances toward atheism: in favor, against, or none. So we also use our classifiers to label each tweet with a moral foundation, and we want to examine the differences in those in the moral foundations for those tweets that are for a topic, in favor of a topic, and those are against a topic. So in particular, we calculate the odds that a tweet in favor of a topic is about 1 foundation versus the odds that a tweet is against that topic based on and if this ratio is above 1, which is the dashed line, then the foundation is associated with the in favor stance toward the topic. So here's an example. On the topic of atheism, tweets in favor of this viewpoint are 3 times as likely to cite the foundation fairness, which is represented by the blue bar. So an example tweet is, if you discriminate based on your religion, then be ready to be discriminated against for having that religion. On the other hand, we observe that those who are against atheism are 10 times as likely to focus on the foundation loyalty here. An example tweet is, well, I would rather stand with God and be judged by the world than stand with the world and be judged by God. Similar findings can be found for most of these 6 topics, and we describe them more in detail later. But there is an exception. There is an exception, which is the topic of the feminist movement. While it can be suggested that those who are in favor of this movement often cite the foundation fairness as their reasoning, we find that it is somewhat equally likely to be used by the other side. So here are the 2 tweets, one in favor, one against the feminist movement, and both underlie the foundation fairness.
So if it's lower, does that mean against or?
If it's higher, that means favor. If it's lower, that means against.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah. So to summarize the second study, we adopt the moral foundations theory and analyze moral content across 5 moral dimensions: authority, care, fairness, loyalty, and sanctity. We show that the differences in moral judgments can be explained by the relative importance of these 5 moral foundations. And in addition, people's collective stance on several controversial topics can also reflect the moral foundations they deem relevant. All right. So this project have, I think, several important implications. The first is that we cannot avoid the complexity and nuance of everyday moral conflicts. They arise from very nominal, familiar topics, such as work, celebrations, family, appearance. And they are much less dramatic and than life and death situations like the trolley problem or organ donation. The modeling of everyday moral dilemmas may also benefit from large observational data sets like AITA, where a large pool of people participate in discourse. The second implication is that existing categorizations of moral intuitions can help reveal the differences in people's collective moral beliefs. The moral foundations theory in particular provides a low-dimensional but interpretive lens through which we may understand people's moral beliefs on many significant matters in daily life. So that's the end of my presentation. There's many people that have been involved in this project. Le Xingxian, Colin Klein are my supervisors. Close collaborators include Alistair Chen, Nick Carroll, Georgie Lyle, Yu Chen as my direct collaborators. I also like to thank many people from the Computational Media Lab, the HMI Grand Challenge, and the School of Computing at large. Thanks.
We have more questions.
Yep.
One
So we should prioritize Suchi then. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Great work. So I think one thing I'm confusing is I feel like a missing component in your talk in those 2 studies is what are the user base, right? So for example, for your first study, I sort of didn't get the idea why you want to recruit some cloud worker to annotate those AITA posts, because I don't know whether we should expect they will give the same answer, let's say, because lots of moral dilemma description, they may relate to, say, some demographic feature, and the demographic feature base could be quite different on Reddit and the cloud worker you recruit from your crowdsourcing platform. So seems like I think that's a big part of I'm missing, like who is giving those labeling and why should we trust them? So I think a natural follow-up study would be, well, there are some group difference, let's say divided by demographic feature, by gender, by race, by political ideology. Yeah, so yeah. And the second is a more technical question is, so you mentioned that you have 3 annotated data set for your second study. So my question is, those three data sets seems like they are all short sentence, right? But I imagine you use this moral foundation framework to do some classification task or some inference on those Reddit submission, which is long text. So I wasn't sure we should completely trust the result. So why should we trust, say, some annotated data on short text, but your task here is on very long text?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So you have two questions. The first one is based on the demographics of the people we recruited in our human study, and the second question is about applying a classifier trained on short text and applying that to longer text, right? So for the first question, I think it's legitimate when you raise a question about what do people from different demographic backgrounds observe or perceive topics to be. So in our study, we have to acknowledge the fact that we did not try to match the pool of participants to any demographic criteria. We did present the demographic statistics relating to the gender of the participants and the country where they're from, and other languages they speak in the paper, but we did not batch that to anyone. I guess the question of whether a person from a different demographic background would perceive the topic of an AITA post to be different. I'm not sure whether that's worthy of investigation, but I can share with you that in the study, in the survey that we gave to participants, we gave them a free-form text to explain to us if there's any other candidate topics that could match the ones that we give them. And the second question, which relates to applying the classifiers to longer text. Yes, you're right. The three data sets that we use to train the classifiers all contain short text. So I think the average number of tokens per example is about 28 tokens. That is much more closely matched to AITA comments, which are on average much shorter than AITA posts. But you're right, applying them to longer posts, to longer texts that are in posts, could raise questions of whether we should trust these labels. So what we have done so far is examine the performance of these classifiers in a range of other out-of-domain data sets. So we looked at vignettes people in the moral psychology literature have used to ask a very much smaller pool of participants. We've also used moral rules of thumb, which are also short text. And I think the indication that we should reasonably trust these labels come from the fact that they all perform well on these external data sets. But you're right, calibrating that to a data set of longer text is a potential concern. And yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Really very great talk. Fantastic. So in the first part, you talked about how the topic pairs can be used to, well, which are used to frame the query, can have quite a big effect on the judgment that is that particular query gets. Do you think that this could possibly be similar to the findings on ChatGPT when it gives different judgments based on how it is posed the query? And could it possibly be used? Could you possibly use these correlations to find how ChatGPT is making these different choices depending on how you frame the question?
Yeah. So I think my understanding of your question is there any effect of framing that could influence ChatGPT's response, right? Yeah, I haven't looked into that. But I think I was quite intrigued by this example on the right-hand side, where you ask the same question about sacrificing one person to save 5 others, and it gives you quite different situations. So I think the effect of framing has been studied in the natural language processing literature. But whether or not it is related to topics and topic pairs in the way it is framed based on topics, we haven't looked into that. Yeah, but yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
How big is this data set of the clean responses? They're just like a sample, or do they have enough that you can actually like analyze?
My recollection of the scientific reports paper on the right-hand side is only a couple of examples. Yeah, there's no quantitative element to that, I believe. Yeah. We'll go to Lachlan now, and then Roger has a question online after Lachlan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask 2 questions. So thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. So thanks for sharing. The first one was about, since it's based on like a lot of the work has been based on Reddit and Twitter posts, does that come with a particular bias, for example, towards younger users, potentially? And is that important at all when thinking about your results? That was my first question. The second question is about a specific slide. Should I give you a chance to answer the first question first? Or?
Yeah, sure. I'll answer the first question. So the question Lachlan asked me was, the scope of this study, specifically the data sets, are social media. So there may be a bias in terms of the demographics of users, right? Maybe they favor younger, more socially active users. And I think this is right. We acknowledge in the paper that this is a large data set. A lot of people participate in it, but there's no guarantee that a representative sample of the population at large participates in this study. So we only claim that this is large enough and interesting enough for us to investigate, but the extent to which it reflects the population in whole is, yeah, we haven't looked in that. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. The second question I want to ask relates to slide 21. I was just wondering, can you explain again the process for how you generated these? I'm just calling them snowflakes, but I don't know.
Radar plots?
Sorry.
Radar plots?
Radar
Yeah.
plots. What's the process that you used to generate these radar plots?
Yeah, so the question is, how did I create this radar plot, right? So this example is based on 700 posts within this topic pair, family and marriage. And the number you see on each radar plot represents the fraction of posts, at least on the left-hand side, the fraction of posts that were labeled with a moral foundation. So in this case, if loyalty is 0.75, that means 75 the posts within this topic pair were labeled with loyalty, contain the foundation loyalty.
And just checking how you get that label from the post.
So we use our classifiers that we train.
So
yeah.
So you've trained classified.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we invite the question from Roger.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed your talk very much. It was very interesting. In relation to the first topic, I was thinking as you went along, what about the possible predictive power of word closeness in terms of embedding? And then you mentioned embedding in a slide in the second topic, but you didn't go into it. Can you say something a bit about that? Yeah,
I can. So my understanding is you're referring to this word embedding similarity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So according to what we understand from the literature of measuring moral dimensions in text, there are several ways people have used to classify moral foundations. So the first one is word count using expert crafted lexicons. So if you are familiar to Look, you probably will think that's familiar. So it's basically just a word count program. The second one is word embedding similarity. So what we did in here was we embed a moral foundation and a piece of text in a high dimensional word embedding, say glove, word to vec, and so on. And the score between a moral foundation and a piece of text is simply considered to be the cosine similarity of their embedded vectors in that space. So the reason I didn't talk in detail about word embedding similarity was because we couldn't try to get it perform well. So we tried different embeddings, we tried different seed words for creating a concept, but we somehow arrive at a method that performs most of the time even worse than word count. So yeah, that's what we observe. Yeah, but I also have to note that some prior work has also used this method to study, to predict or to label text with moral foundations, and we think that it could be problematic based on the performance we've seen.
Thanks. So just to finish, what I was really wondering was whether the cosine similarity, the closeness, if you like, in a detailed embedding with a huge vocabulary like Glove you mentioned, would be a predictor of the dual topic relationships that you talked about in the first half. But that's very, very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I probably can get back to you on that. Yeah. Yeah, question. Yeah, please.
Hi.
Oh. Sorry.
Yeah. So
yeah,
really interesting talk, especially because I mean it's such an interesting topic that I do not have the expertise of like understanding computer science. So the first question is like the way I'm imagining this work leading towards, especially in terms of AI agents, is somehow being having in the future AI agents being equipped with morality sensors, right? Like you are taking in some data or like you're sensing some information and you have access to some classification or model that can give you information about morality. So the question I had was like, does the philosophy side of like your investigation inform about whether the thing we are trying to predict is absolute? So because right now, from what I understand, what you're actually studying is a proxy for morality, which is the direct democracy of EID, right? It's just that community's upvote minus downvote. That's basically the proxy for what we understand as morality in the study. So do you have any thoughts on whether the philosophy literature informs about like whether this is a good proxy to be studying for populations' response to morality instead of there is a theoretical basis for morality?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I'll just repeat that for the online audience, which is there any features, if you will, or characteristics of morality that could be embedded in AI systems? And I think that relates to the philosophical literature. And when I looked into the way people perceive Delphi, which is the prototype that preceded ChatGPT, but made a lot of headlines, especially in the philosophy community. You know, it's not surprising to see that people have concerns about this, about whether it actually is producing moral judgments or whether it's only reflecting the data set that it was trained on. And it was actually acknowledged by the authors that, well, this only reflects what they believe to be an average American evaluation of the ethicality or social acceptability of such thing. So on the question of what can we theoretically model, or what can we theoretically represent when it comes to generating moral judgments, I think moral foundations, the 5 moral dimensions, are important covariates. People have shown that it explains all kinds of phenomena. You know, not just vaccine hesitation, but people have studied that on the topic of abortion, on the topic of even organ donation, and so on. So I think that is one of the candidates for what can be measured and what can matter in a moral judgment. Obviously, I don't think I have a clear answer as to what is an exhaustive list of things that we can, yeah.
Ask me, Carol to come.
Oh, Nick Carroll is in here. Nick Carroll is one of our collaborators. So if Nick, if you want to chime in with any thoughts on this. Yeah. Oh, all right. But yeah, I think well, my take only on this is that the moral considerations that end up leading to a moral judgment is quite are quite understudied, at least by us computer scientists. Yeah.
And like, I think your insight on, like a lot of these questions are tending towards kind of the representation power of data sets, right?
Yeah.
Because it can change over demographics, it can change over time, it can change over like what subreddit you're looking at, right? So, yeah, like I don't know the answer to that question. That's why I was curious whether like morality has some absolute ground truth which we are trying to approximate, or like is there any way more?
No.
So,
As anything philosophy, they don't agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the thing is, the blank that is filled is, as also for this field. There's lots of work in the literature that tries to train a machine out for the judgment. Yes, right. No, which is less interesting for us. The blank space that this work fills is what kind of moral dilemmas puzzle people on a daily basis. And there's 100,000 of them. So which is a rich sample, we're not claiming it's a representative. And there's another whole set of social scientists and moral psychologists who study cross-cultural differences and actually go and measure them in country information. But the limitation of those studies is they don't scale. So you can ask the simple question, like, so having translated maximum 5 to 10 different languages, and then measure people's response across different countries, and that makes sense of that. So it's hard to sort of scale in both dimensions. There's no, and the level that these topics are at, and also the moral foundations are at, is a lot coarser than brain, which itself is a hard enough. But if you know good NLP tools, that's
But I think adding on that point, if you're looking at a model that outputs a binary decision of you're right, you're wrong, and you present a table of F1 on whatever data set you have, you're not going to raise any interest from the philosophy community. We did that, and our collaborators said, well, that doesn't mean anything. Yeah.
Right, so I think there's so our philosophy collaborators, there are two of them on the team. And they are working, like they feel they have enough to write a philosophy book with like basically daily issues being discussed as moral dilemmas being discussed. Like where the boundary of moral versus non-moral is it, and also how the patterns of judgment and controversy, which is the use working out as basically follow-ups and essential topics. Basically, when people disagree, are we all very sure about we just disagree, like the issue of abortion like that, or are we just not sure about we still end up this? So we have some results of that, which is about later.
Should we move to Evan's question?
It's kind of problem by this discussion. I'm trying to say framing as turns out is important. I'm following this. It's very subject on how you frame it. It's all sentiment because it's a one-sided story. I think there's a fundamental intrinsic moral belief of the original poster that tries to make people agree with them. right? And it's basically how well you frame your problem. There's certain cues that you can make that you can see yourself as a good guy, and then how easily this is perceived by the rest of the users. Whereas different reflex statements like this is right or not. So there's fundamentals coming in the lesson about. I don't think machines can do that because humans can get statements in that. So perhaps if you can remove the sentiment from like the original post, then figure out the facts, but I'm not sure how you can do.
Yeah. So Evan asked a question about the effective framing and how that relates to how people judge, right? I think the effective framing is quite widely understood, widely acknowledged. You know, in a psychological study, when people ask you to have an option to opt out of organ donation or opt in of organ donation, you can make a decision and they're equal. But the rate that people opt in is much lower than the rate that people opt out. And so that's a classic study. And pertaining to the data set that we have, the AITA data set, there's been a prior work on the exact same data set where people examine the features, the linguistic features, and assess that in relation to the judgments that a post gets. And the main finding of the paper was that, well, there are some linguistic features that relate to how you present yourself as an actor in the story. So the finding is, if you describe a situation where you place yourself as the victim, you have a much higher chance of being sympathized with. But if you place yourself as an aggressor based on some linguistic cues, then your chance of getting a wrong verdict is much higher than that. Yeah.
My question is more like, if I have a post, then there's a verdict on the moral dilemma. Then if you can get the opposite side to have explain their side for another post, will the original decision on the moral dilemma spectrum change based on if you have the full side whereas the only one side that can have. Something like that. So like the question to the future.
There are some cases that we have the same similar post. We only change the media people to the people that want to post. After people's response changes. So yeah, that means the bias still exists. And how do we let the model remove the bias? Well, we have the bias.
Yeah, if you can actually system can do that.
I don't have a clear answer to that, but I do acknowledge the effect that framing is quite important when you want to influence people. And we know that a lot of moral judgments are based on emotions. Yeah. Yep. Should we conclude with your question then?
Yeah. Let's thank Josh for the interesting topic today.